I stood frozen at my brother's wedding reception, watching my parents publicly humiliate me in front of 380 guests. My mother loudly declared I was the family disappointment who could never afford such an elegant event, while my father joked about my pretend business ventures. The crowd laughed as my parents compared me unfavorably to my successful attorney brother. What they didn't know was that I secretly owned Sterling Events, the exclusive catering company providing their $100,000 reception. In 60 seconds, I'd make a decision that would change everything forever. My name is Keegan, and that Saturday afternoon in September started like any other family gathering, which meant I braced myself for the usual emotional beating. I pulled into the circular driveway of Riverside Country Club, adjusting my navy blue suit jacket one final time. The pristine grounds stretched before me, manicured lawns dotted with century-old oak trees whose leaves were just beginning their autumn transformation. Marcus. My older brother was marrying Catherine Harrison, daughter of Judge William Harrison. The guest list read like a who's who of our city's elite. I recognized senators, business moguls, and society figures stepping out of luxury vehicles driven by professional chauffeurs. My own modest sedan looked embarrassingly out of place among the Bentleys and Maseratis. What none of these distinguished guests knew was that I owned Sterling Events, the catering company responsible for every detail of this lavish celebration. For 3 years, I'd operated under a carefully constructed shell company structure, keeping my identity hidden from clients and especially from my family. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents had unknowingly hired their disappointment son to cater their golden child's wedding. I'd built Sterling Events from nothing, starting with a $5,000 loan and working 18-hour days. We now employed 47 full-time staff members and generated 7 figures annually. Our client roster included Fortune 500 companies, political fundraisers, and exactly the type of high society events where I currently felt like an unwelcome intruder. The September air carried hints of wood smoke and dying leaves as guests mingled during cocktail hour. Crystal glasses clinked against a backdrop of string quartet music I'd personally selected. My earpiece crackled softly with updates from Sarah, my operations manager, confirming that the first course was precisely on schedule. I spotted my parents near the champagne fountain, already holding court with a circle of influential guests. David, my father, wore his most expensive charcoal suit, the one he reserved for impressing potential business contacts. Linda, my mother, sparkled in a silver-beaded gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. They gestured animatedly, clearly entertaining their audience with some story. My stomach dropped as I realized they were talking about me. Moving closer while pretending to admire the floral arrangements I'd designed myself, I caught fragments of their conversation. The mayor's wife, Eleanor Blackwood, listened with the polite attention as wealthy people reserve for amusing anecdotes about the less fortunate. Keegan was always our challenging child, Linda said, her voice carrying that particular tone mothers use when discussing family disappointments. While Marcus excelled academically, poor Keegan struggled with everything. We practically had to beg his teachers to pass him each year. My face burned. That was completely false. I'd maintained a 3.7 GPA throughout high school while working part-time jobs to pay for my own expenses. My parents had simply never bothered to attend parent conferences or graduation ceremonies. David nodded sagely, adding his own embellishments to the fabricated narrative. We tried to encourage him, but he never showed any real aptitude for anything substantial. His current job involves working for some catering company, probably washing dishes or loading trucks. The gathered guests made sympathetic noises, glancing in my direction with poorly concealed pity. I wanted to disappear into the perfectly manicured hedgerows. The poor dear still lives with us, Linda continued, warming to her theme. At 28, he simply hasn't developed the independence that Marcus showed from such an early age. We worry about what will happen to him when we're no longer around to provide guidance. Another complete fabrication. I'd moved out 6 years ago and owned a 4-bedroom house in the city's historic district. But contradicting them publicly would only create the kind of scene my parents thrived on. Eleanor Blackwood's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine concern. How difficult that must be for your family. Have you considered professional intervention? We've tried everything, David replied with practiced resignation. Therapy career counseling even offered to pay for trade school, but Keegan seems content with his current situation. Some children simply aren't destined for success. The circle of guests nodded knowingly as if they'd encountered similar disappointments in their own families. I stood there, invisible yet thoroughly dissected, listening to my parents destroy my reputation with surgical precision. The cruelest part was watching how much they enjoyed it. This wasn't accidental cruelty born from ignorance or misunderstanding. They were deliberately crafting a narrative that positioned them as long-suffering parents burdened with an inadequate son. Every word was calculated to generate sympathy while establishing their own martyrdom. Judge Harrison approached the group, his imposing figure commanding immediate attention. "I must compliment whoever selected your catering company," he said to my parents. "The presentation is absolutely exceptional. Sterling Events has outdone themselves." I held my breath, waiting for my parents' response. "Oh yes," Linda replied airily. "We spared no expense for Marcus and Catherine. Only the finest for our successful son's special day." The judge nodded approvingly. "Wise investment. Quality vendors make all the difference, though I imagine the cost must be substantial." David puffed up with pride. "Price was no object. We wanted Catherine's family to see that we appreciate quality and aren't afraid to pay for excellence. Unlike some people who cut corners and settle for mediocrity." His pointed look in my direction made his meaning crystal clear to everyone present. Even the mayor's wife looked uncomfortable with the obvious reference. That's when Linda delivered the final blow to my dignity. Speaking loudly enough for nearby guests to overhear, she announced, "We actually had to create completely fictional achievements for Keegan's high school graduation announcements, because he literally had none of his own. Can you imagine 18 years old and not a single accomplishment worth mentioning?" The group erupted in sympathetic laughter, the kind reserved for harmlessly embarrassing family stories. Except this story was neither harmless nor entirely true. I'd graduated with honors, received a partial scholarship to culinary school, and won 3 regional cooking competitions during high school. But my parents had thrown away the acceptance letters and never told anyone about the competitions because they didn't consider cooking a respectable career path. They'd wanted me to pursue something traditional, like law or business, and when I refused to abandon my passion, they'd systematically undermined every achievement I'd earned. Standing there listening to their fictional version of my life, I felt something shift inside my chest. The familiar shame and embarrassment began transforming into something harder and more purposeful. They wanted to play games with my reputation. Fine. But they'd forgotten one crucial detail. I held all the cards. The wedding ceremony proceeded with flawless precision under my discreet orchestration. Hidden behind century-old columns, I coordinated with Sarah through my nearly invisible earpiece, ensuring every element unfolded seamlessly. The bride's train fell in perfect cascades down the marble steps. The flower arrangements I'd personally designed created a romantic canopy of white roses and baby's breath. Even the lighting struck the altar at precisely the right angle to create that magical glow photographers dream about. Catherine looked radiant in her grandmother's restored vintage gown while Marcus stood proudly in his custom tuxedo. For a moment, watching them exchange vows, I almost forgot about the humiliation brewing just beyond the ceremony's sacred bubble. During the cocktail reception that followed, my parents resumed their character assassination with renewed enthusiasm. The changed venue seemed to invigorate their performance, as if the elegant ballroom provided a more suitable stage for their theatrical cruelty. I positioned myself near the gift table, ostensibly admiring the elaborate presents, while actually monitoring my parents' continued social destruction of my identity. They'd attracted a larger audience now, including several families I'd been hoping to cultivate as potential clients. The conversation had evolved from general disappointment into specific examples of my alleged failures. Linda regaled the group with stories about my dating life, each anecdote more damaging than the last. "Poor Jessica," she said, referring to my college girlfriend. "Such a lovely girl with so much potential. I ran into her at Whole Foods last month and felt obligated to warn her about Keegan's situation." My stomach clenched. Jessica and I had dated for 2 years during college and remained friendly afterward. She was now a successful marketing executive, and I'd been considering reaching out about a potential business collaboration. "What did you tell her?" asked Mrs. Pemberton, wife of the city's largest real estate developer. Linda's eyes sparkled with malicious satisfaction. "Well, I couldn't let her harbor unrealistic expectations. I explained that Keegan had dropped out of school and was currently living in our basement while trying to figure out his next move. The poor dear looked so disappointed. My blood turned cold. That conversation explained why Jessica had suddenly stopped returning my calls 3 months ago. I'd been confused by her abrupt withdrawal, especially since our last interaction had been perfectly pleasant. Now I understood that my mother had sabotaged yet another relationship with her toxic interference. David sensed an opportunity to contribute his own revelations. I also had to have a difficult conversation with that business partner Keegan thought he'd found a few years back. Nice enough fellow, but he deserved to know what he was getting into. The memory hit me like a physical blow. 3 years ago, I'd nearly secured a partnership with Thomas Creek, owner of a successful restaurant chain. We'd spent months developing plans for a catering expansion that would have accelerated Sterling Events' growth exponentially. Then suddenly, without explanation, he'd withdrawn from negotiations and stopped taking my calls. What kind of conversation, Mrs. Pemberton prompted, clearly invested in this family drama? "Nothing malicious," David replied with false modesty. "Just father to businessman." I mentioned that Keegan had some reliability issues and possibly some underlying mental health concerns that might affect his professional judgment. Sometimes honesty is the kindest approach. The words felt like ice water flooding my veins. My father had deliberately destroyed a deal that could have changed my life, then watched me struggle to understand what went wrong. He'd sat across from me at family dinners listening to my confusion and frustration, knowing exactly why my carefully planned partnership had imploded. The revelation kept expanding as more family members joined the conversation. My Aunt Nancy, my mother's sister, laughed knowingly as she shared her own contribution to my professional sabotage. "Linda called me before my anniversary party last year," Nancy said. "She warned me that Keegan wasn't ready for such an important event. Said he tended to get overwhelmed under pressure and might disappoint guests. So I went with that lovely company from downtown instead." I remembered that conversation with Nancy. I'd been crushed when she chose another caterer after initially seeming enthusiastic about working with me. That contract would have been worth $15,000 and provided exposure to her extensive social network. Instead, my own family had poisoned the opportunity before it could develop. The scope of their interference was staggering. Years of mysterious relationship failures, business opportunities that vanished without explanation, social connections that inexplicably went cold suddenly made perfect sense. My parents hadn't simply failed to support my independence. They'd actively worked to prevent it. Uncle Robert, my father's brother, nodded sympathetically as he added his own piece to the puzzle. Similar situation with the country club application. David mentioned that Keegan wasn't quite ready for that level of social responsibility. Probably saved him from embarrassment, honestly. I'd applied for membership at Riverside Country Club 2 years ago as a business investment. Networking opportunities in that environment could have accelerated Sterling Events' growth significantly. When my application was rejected without clear explanation, I'd assumed my financial status hadn't met their standards. Learning that my father had sabotaged the process felt like discovering a betrayal that went back years. The most devastating revelation came when Linda casually mentioned something that recontextualized my entire adolescence. Speaking to Judge Harrison's wife, she said, "We tried to guide Keegan toward realistic expectations from an early age. When those silly cooking schools kept sending acceptance letters, we knew he needed protection from his own unrealistic dreams. My world stopped spinning. Acceptance letters. Plural. I'd applied to 6 culinary programs during my senior year of high school, but only received rejection letters. At 17, those rejections had crushed my confidence and nearly convinced me to abandon cooking entirely. But there had been acceptances. Multiple acceptances that my parents had hidden from me. Sometimes parents have to make difficult decisions, Linda continued. We knew that pursuing cooking professionally would only lead to disappointment and financial instability. Much better to help him face reality before he wasted years chasing impossible dreams. The conversation around me continued, but I could no longer process individual words. My parents had stolen my choices, manipulated my opportunities, and watched me struggle with self-doubt, while knowing they'd created every obstacle I'd faced. The cruelest part was realizing how much energy I'd wasted, questioning my own judgment and abilities. Every failed relationship, every missed business opportunity, every moment of confusion about why my life wasn't progressing despite my efforts could be traced back to their interference. Sarah's voice crackled through my earpiece, startling me back to the present moment. First course service beginning in 10 minutes. The kitchen staff reports everything is running perfectly. I touched my earpiece briefly to acknowledge her update, then looked around the ballroom where 380 guests enjoyed cocktails and appetizers prepared under my direction. These people had no idea they were consuming food, created by the same person my parents were systematically destroying in their conversations. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so painful. My parents had unknowingly hired the son they considered a failure to provide the centerpiece of their social triumph. Sterling Events was responsible for every detail they were using to impress their friends and establish their family's reputation. But as I watched them continue their character assassination, poisoning new relationships and business opportunities in real time, I realized something had fundamentally changed inside me. The shame and confusion I'd carried for years was hardening into something much more dangerous. They wanted to play games with my reputation and my future. They'd forgotten one crucial detail about the son they'd so thoroughly underestimated. I wasn't the failure they'd painted me to be. I was the owner of the company they were currently bragging about to anyone who would listen. And unlike their fictional narratives, my success was real, documented, and absolutely within my power to prove. The dinner service began with military precision, my staff executing the choreographed ballet of fine dining service I'd perfected over 3 years. Guests moved from cocktail reception to the main ballroom where round tables dressed in ivory linens awaited. Each place setting featured hand-selected china patterns and crystal stemware that caught the chandelier light like captured stars. I found my assigned seat at the family table strategically positioned where I could observe the entire room while monitoring service through my earpiece. My parents held court at the head table with Marcus Catherine and the Harrison family, their animated conversation clearly visible across the elegant space. The first course, a delicate butternut squash bisque garnished with roasted chestnuts and microgreens, received enthusiastic approval from guests. Judge Harrison specifically complimented the presentation to my parents, who graciously accepted praise for an event they'd had nothing to do with planning or executing. Marcus rose to deliver his groom's speech, tapping his champagne glass to capture the room's attention. His confident bearing reflected years of courtroom experience, and his words flowed with practiced eloquence. "Thank you all for sharing this incredible evening with Catherine and me," he began, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "This celebration represents not just our union, but the culmination of values our parents instilled in both our families." He gestured toward our parents and the Harrisons, generating appreciative applause from the assembled guests. "David and Linda taught me that success comes from hard work, dedication, and surrounding yourself with people who share your commitment to excellence. They always knew how to guide their sons toward meaningful achievement." His pointed look in my direction made his meaning unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The phrase, "their sons," carried obvious implications about which son had successfully absorbed those lessons, and which had not. Some people spend their lives chasing unrealistic dreams. Marcus continued, his smile never wavering. But true maturity means recognizing your limitations and finding appropriate ways to contribute to society. My parents helped me understand that distinction early in life. The subtext was crystal clear to everyone at our table and anyone else who'd been listening to my parents' earlier character assassination. Marcus was publicly reinforcing their narrative about my failures while positioning himself as the son who'd learned life's important lessons. When the microphone was passed around for family toasts, David accepted it with the confidence of someone accustomed to public speaking. He'd built his commercial real estate business through networking and social connections, and events like this were his natural habitat. Friends, family, distinguished guests. He began, his voice rich with paternal pride. Today we celebrate not just a marriage, but the vindication of good parenting and traditional values. The room settled into polite attention as David launched into what initially seemed like a standard father of the groom speech. He praised Catherine's family, complimented Judge Harrison's distinguished service, and thanked guests for their presence. Then the tone shifted. Raising children in today's world requires tough love and honest assessment of their capabilities, David said, his voice taking on a more serious quality. Linda and I learned that protecting our sons sometimes meant helping them face difficult truths about themselves. My stomach clenched as I realized where this was heading. Marcus embraced the challenges we presented and transformed them into motivation for achievement. He understood that success requires sacrifice, discipline, and realistic goal setting. That's why he's standing here today as a partner in the city's most prestigious law firm, married to a wonderful woman from a family we deeply respect. Appreciative murmurs rippled through the crowd as guests nodded approval of Marcus's accomplishments. But honest parenting also means acknowledging when a child needs continued guidance and support. David continued, his eyes finding mine across the room. Some young people require more time to mature, more assistance finding their place in the world. As parents, we never give up hope, but we also must be realistic about timelines and expectations. The euphemistic language fooled no one. David was publicly categorizing me as the family's ongoing project, the son who required continued parental management because he couldn't function independently. Linda accepted the microphone next, her silver gown glittering under the chandelier lights as she prepared to add her own perspective to David's assessment. Keegan has always been our dreamer, she said with maternal fondness that barely concealed condescension. While Marcus focused on practical achievement, Keegan chased creative pursuits that, while personally fulfilling, didn't translate into real-world success. She paused for effect, allowing the implicit criticism to settle over the room. We've watched him struggle with unrealistic expectations about his capabilities and potential. The gap between his ambitions and his actual skills created constant disappointment that we as loving parents had to help him navigate. My face burned as 380 guests absorbed this psychological evaluation delivered under the guise of motherly concern. Linda was systematically destroying my credibility while positioning herself as the long-suffering parent dealing with a problematic child. Keegan's current employment with a catering company represents progress toward accepting appropriate expectations, she continued. We're proud that he's finally found steady work that matches his skill level, even if it's not the career path he originally imagined. The patronizing tone made it clear she considered my job a consolation prize, suitable for someone who'd failed to achieve anything more substantial. But Linda wasn't finished with her public dismantling of my character. Which brings us to an important announcement, she said, her voice taking on the gravity reserved for significant family decisions. David and I have been updating our estate planning, and we've decided to leave our inheritance entirely to Marcus and his future children. The room fell into uncomfortable silence as guests processed this unexpected revelation. Estate decisions are typically private family matters, not public announcements at wedding receptions. This decision reflects our confidence in Marcus's ability to manage family assets responsibly, David added, reclaiming the microphone. Some children learn to stand on their own feet, while others need to discover that they can't rely on handouts forever. We believe this approach will ultimately benefit both our sons. The implicit message was devastating. They were publicly disinheriting me while framing it as tough love designed for my own good. The 380 witnesses to this announcement would forever remember me as the son considered too irresponsible to inherit family wealth. Marcus accepted the microphone back with a satisfied smile that suggested he'd known about this decision in advance. Thank you, Dad and Mom, for always knowing how to challenge us to become better people. Your guidance shaped who Catherine and I are today. The room erupted in polite applause, but I caught uncomfortable glances from several guests who recognized they'd witnessed something cruel disguised as family tradition. Judge Harrison approached me as the applause died down, his distinguished face showing genuine sympathy. Son, I apologize for what you just experienced. That was unnecessarily harsh. He paused, studying my face with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading people's character. I must say, though, whoever organized this evening deserves tremendous credit. The service has been absolutely flawless. Would you happen to know how I might contact Sterling Events? I'd like to discuss some upcoming functions. My heart stopped. Judge Harrison, one of the most respected figures in our city's social hierarchy, was praising my work while having no idea I was responsible for it. The irony was almost too perfect to comprehend. I'll make sure you get their contact information. I managed to reply, my voice steadier than I felt. The judge nodded approvingly. Excellent. Quality vendors are difficult to find, and this level of execution is truly rare. As he walked away, I realized that my parents had unknowingly created the perfect opportunity for me to demonstrate exactly how wrong their assessment of my capabilities had been. They'd used Sterling Events as a prop in their narrative about family success while simultaneously destroying the reputation of Sterling Events' actual owner. The contradiction was so absurd it would have been funny if it weren't happening to me. But as I watched them continue accepting compliments for an event I'd orchestrated, listening to guests praise the excellence I'd delivered, a new understanding crystallized in my mind. They'd played their hand completely. They'd revealed the full extent of their cruelty, sabotage, and manipulation in front of the most influential people in our city. They'd backed themselves into a corner where their continued social standing depended on maintaining lies that I now had the power to expose. For the first time in my adult life, I held advantages they didn't know existed. And unlike their fictional narratives, my advantages were real, documented, and absolutely within my power to deploy. The evening air carried hints of autumn as I stepped onto the country club's marble terrace, desperately needing space to process what had just occurred. The ballroom's warmth and laughter felt suffocating after witnessing my own public character assassination disguised as family love. Through the French doors, I could see my staff maintaining perfect service despite the family drama. The second course, pan-seared Atlantic salmon with herb butter sauce, was being delivered to each table with choreographed precision. Sarah's coordination through our communication system ensured that 380 guests remained completely unaware of any behind-the-scenes complications. My earpiece crackled softly with status updates, but I barely registered the professional chatter. The scope of my parents' betrayal kept expanding as I replayed their carefully orchestrated public humiliation. They hadn't simply failed to support my independence. They'd actively sabotaged it while positioning themselves as martyred parents, dealing with a disappointment son. The terrace doors opened behind me, and I turned to see Marcus emerging with Catherine and my parents. They huddled near the decorative fountain, their voices carrying clearly across the stone patio. That went perfectly, Marcus said with obvious satisfaction. Did you see Harrison's face when Dad announced the inheritance decision? The whole room understood exactly what kind of family management Keegan requires. My stomach dropped as I realized they were conducting a post-performance analysis of my public humiliation. Linda laughed with genuine delight. The timing couldn't have been better. Having all these influential people witness our approach to Keegan's situation establishes the narrative perfectly. No one will question our family dynamics after tonight. Catherine shifted uncomfortably, her wedding gown rustling against the stone balustrade. Don't you think that was somewhat harsh? Keegan looked devastated. Sometimes tough love feels harsh, David replied dismissively. But Keegan needs to understand his place in this family's hierarchy. Tonight's lesson will benefit him long term. Marcus placed a protective arm around his new wife's shoulders. Catherine, you'll understand our family better after you've observed Keegan's patterns for a while. Our parents have been dealing with his delusions for years. The casual cruelty in his voice made my hands clench into fists. This wasn't accidental insensitivity born from ignorance. They were celebrating the success of a carefully planned psychological assault. But Linda's next revelation stopped my breath completely. The beautiful irony, she said with malicious glee, is that we specifically chose Sterling Events because we heard Keegan worked for some catering company. We thought it would be perfectly poetic for him to serve at his successful brother's wedding. My world tilted on its axis. They'd known about my connection to catering and had deliberately selected my company as part of their humiliation strategy. Marcus nodded approvingly. When I discovered through my legal contacts that Keegan actually owns Sterling Events, I nearly told you to choose someone else. But then I realized how absolutely hilarious this situation could become. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Marcus had known about my success for months and had kept silent specifically to maximize my humiliation. He'd watched our parents unknowingly hire me while planning this evening's character assassination. How long have you known? Catherine asked, her voice carrying new concern about her husband's character. About 6 months, Marcus replied casually. One of my corporate clients mentioned Sterling Events during a contract negotiation. When I researched the ownership structure, Keegan's name appeared in the filing documents, but I figured our parents deserved to discover his little deception organically. Little deception. My 3 years of building a successful business from nothing was characterized as deception, because I'd kept my family from sabotaging it, like they'd sabotaged everything else. David's voice carried genuine surprise as he processed this information. Keegan owns the catering company. How is that possible? We would have heard about any significant business success. He's been operating under shell company structures, Marcus explained with the casual expertise of someone who researched corporate formations professionally. Probably to avoid family scrutiny or creditor discovery. The business appears to be legitimately profitable, which makes tonight's lesson even more important. Linda's laugh carried a sharp edge that made my skin crawl. So, our failure son has been hiding business success while letting us believe he's a struggling employee. That level of deception proves exactly why he can't be trusted with family inheritance. The twisted logic was breathtaking. My success was being reframed as evidence of character flaws that justified their earlier sabotage and tonight's public humiliation. Catherine's discomfort was becoming increasingly visible. If Keegan owns a successful company, doesn't that contradict everything you've said about his capabilities? Success and character are different things, David replied with the confidence of someone accustomed to rationalizing contradictory evidence. Building a business requires certain skills, but managing family relationships and accepting appropriate guidance requires maturity that Keegan clearly hasn't developed. Marcus added his professional perspective to their collective rationalization. Corporate success doesn't automatically translate to personal growth. If anything, Keegan's deception about his business proves he hasn't learned the honesty and family loyalty that real success requires. They were systematically redefining success to exclude anything I'd achieved while maintaining their narrative about my character defects. The mental gymnastics required for such rationalization would have been impressive if it weren't being used to justify years of emotional abuse. Besides, Linda added with renewed malicious pleasure, 380 influential people just witnessed our family's honest assessment of Keegan's character. His business credentials won't matter if our social circle understands his personal limitations. The calculated nature of their strategy became crystal clear. They weren't just destroying my reputation. They were inoculating their social network against any evidence of my success that might surface later. Sarah's voice crackled through my earpiece, startling me back to immediate reality. Third course, ready for service. Should I proceed with normal timing? Her question carried subtle concern, probably because she'd noticed my extended absence from coordination duties. Sterling Events' reputation depended on flawless execution, regardless of personal drama affecting the owner. I touched my earpiece to acknowledge her message, then looked back toward the ballroom where my staff continued delivering exceptional service to guests who were simultaneously witnessing my character destruction. The contradiction crystallized into perfect clarity. My parents were bragging about the quality of an event I'd orchestrated while systematically destroying the reputation of the person responsible for that quality. They were using my success as evidence of their sophisticated taste, while characterizing me as a failure who couldn't be trusted with independence. But as I processed the full scope of their manipulation, a different understanding began forming in my mind. They'd revealed everything: their years of sabotage, their current manipulation strategy, their future plans for maintaining family hierarchy. They'd exposed the complete architecture of their emotional abuse in front of witnesses who could verify every detail. More importantly, they'd done it while surrounded by 380 potential clients who were currently experiencing the highest level of service excellence Sterling Events could provide. They'd created the perfect demonstration of the gap between their fictional narratives and documented reality. For the first time in my adult life, I held information they didn't know I possessed. I understood their strategy completely while they remained ignorant of my true capabilities and resources. The decision point was approaching rapidly. Sarah would need direction about the remainder of the evening's service. My staff was positioned throughout the ballroom awaiting instructions. 380 guests were enjoying an event that showcased exactly the level of excellence my parents claimed I could never achieve. I could continue enduring their abuse, allowing them to poison my reputation while taking credit for my work. Or I could demonstrate exactly how wrong their assessment of my character had been. As I watched them through the terrace doors still celebrating their successful humiliation strategy, I realized they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd forgotten that I wasn't the powerless child they'd spent years undermining. I was a business owner with resources, reputation, and the documented ability to orchestrate complex operations under pressure. Tonight's lesson was about to continue, but they wouldn't be the ones teaching it. I returned to the ballroom with newfound clarity, the weight of decision settled firmly in my chest. The third course service was concluding perfectly, my staff clearing plates with the synchronized precision that had built Sterling Events' reputation among the city's elite. Instead of retreating to avoid further humiliation, I approached the small platform where the microphone awaited family toasts and anniversary wishes. The ballroom's acoustic design would carry my voice clearly to every corner, ensuring that all 380 guests could hear whatever I chose to share. Marcus noticed my movement toward the speaking area and shot me a warning look that clearly communicated his expectation that I remain silent. Our parents, deep in conversation with Judge Harrison about the evening's exceptional quality, seemed oblivious to my intentions. I accepted the microphone from the wedding coordinator, a young woman who'd worked seamlessly with my staff throughout the evening. Her smile suggested she had no awareness of the family drama that had been unfolding parallel to her professional responsibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice carrying easily across the elegant space. I hope everyone has enjoyed this evening's celebration of Marcus and Catherine's marriage. The room settled into polite attention, guests turning from their dessert course conversations to focus on what they assumed would be a brief family toast. Before we continue with the evening's festivities, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the exceptional service you've all experienced tonight. Sterling Events has worked tirelessly to create an atmosphere worthy of this special occasion. Appreciative murmurs rippled through the crowd as guests nodded agreement. Several people had already approached me during the evening to compliment various aspects of the service and ambiance. Great events require attention to every detail. I continued, warming to my theme. From the initial menu planning to the final presentation, Sterling Events takes pride in delivering experiences that exceed expectations while remaining invisible to guests. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly from his table, clearly pleased to hear recognition for the vendors who'd contributed to the evening's success. I've had the privilege of observing Sterling Events' operation tonight, and I can personally attest to their commitment to excellence. The coordination required for an event of this scope is remarkable, especially when working with such distinguished clientele. My parents began paying attention now, probably wondering why I was delivering an advertisement for the catering company instead of offering traditional family sentiments. Sterling Events' philosophy centers on the belief that every client deserves treatment that reflects their importance and dignity. They understand that great service comes from respecting people rather than judging them based on assumptions or preconceptions. The message was subtle but pointed, designed to resonate with guests who'd witnessed my earlier public humiliation while establishing principles that would frame what came next. In my professional experience, I said allowing a note of authority to enter my voice. The companies that achieve lasting success are those that focus on lifting people up rather than tearing them down. They create value through genuine excellence rather than through diminishing others. Catherine caught the implications immediately, her expression shifting as she began connecting my words to the evening's earlier events. Several other guests were following the subtext, their faces showing growing interest in where this speech was heading. Which brings me to a personal disclosure that I believe you all deserve to hear, I said, pausing to ensure complete attention throughout the ballroom. The silence was absolute. 380 people focused entirely on my next words. I am Keegan Mitchell, and I am the owner and founder of Sterling Events. The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. Gasps and exclamations erupted from tables throughout the ballroom as guests processed this unexpected information. My parents' faces drained of color as they realized the implications of what I'd just revealed. For 3 years, I've built this company based on the principle that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. Tonight's exceptional service represents the work of 47 dedicated employees who share that commitment to excellence. Judge Harrison stood at his table beginning to applaud with genuine enthusiasm. Outstanding young man, absolutely outstanding work. His approval sparked a wave of similar responses throughout the room. Guests began rising to offer their own appreciation, creating a sustained ovation that completely transformed the evening's energy. Sterling Events has had the honor of serving Fortune 500 corporate events, political fundraisers, and exactly these types of celebrations where families come together to acknowledge love and achievement. I continued once the applause subsided. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear through the marble floor. Catherine's expression combined admiration with growing concern about her new husband's family dynamics. I want to thank everyone who has complimented tonight's service because those kind words reflect on my staff's professionalism and dedication. Building a company that serves this community's most important events has been the greatest privilege of my professional life. Mrs. Pemberton, the real estate developer's wife, approached my parents' table with obvious excitement. David, you never mentioned that Keegan owned such a successful company. We've been trying to book Sterling Events for our anniversary celebration. Before my parents could respond, Judge Harrison's voice carried across the ballroom. I must say this explains the exceptional quality we've experienced tonight. Keegan, I'd like to discuss several upcoming functions that would benefit from Sterling Events services. Additional guests began approaching, business cards appearing as networking opportunities materialized in real time. The social dynamic was shifting rapidly as people reassessed their understanding of our family hierarchy. I believe true success comes from creating value for others while maintaining integrity under pressure, I said, reclaiming the microphone's attention. Tonight has tested both those principles, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate that Sterling Events can deliver excellence regardless of challenging circumstances. The pointed reference to challenging circumstances resonated with guests who'd witnessed my parents' earlier character assassination. They were beginning to understand that they'd witnessed something far more complex than typical family dynamics. Eleanor Blackwood, the mayor's wife, stood to address the room. I think we can all agree that discovering such impressive entrepreneurial success within our community deserves recognition. Keegan, your company has clearly earned its reputation for excellence." Her endorsement carried significant weight among the assembled social hierarchy. Other influential figures began voicing similar sentiments, creating momentum that completely overshadowed my parents' earlier narrative. Sterling Events looks forward to continuing our service to this community's most important celebrations, I concluded. Thank you for allowing us to be part of Marcus and Catherine's special day. As I stepped down from the platform, the transformation was remarkable. Guests who'd earlier viewed me with pity were now approaching with genuine interest and respect. Business opportunities that my parents had systematically sabotaged for years were materializing faster than I could process. Judge Harrison reached me first, his handshake firm and his expression genuinely impressed. "Son, what you've built here is remarkable. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss several events, including some judicial conference functions that require the highest level of discretion and quality." Behind him, a line of potential clients was forming, each person eager to discuss upcoming celebrations that could benefit from Sterling Events services. My parents stood frozen at their table, watching their carefully constructed narrative disintegrate in real time as the community's power structure reassessed everything they'd been told about their family dynamics. The evening was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted fundamentally. For the first time in my adult life, I was operating from a position of strength, while my parents scrambled to understand how their strategy had backfired so completely. The networking momentum following my revelation threatened to overwhelm the wedding reception, as guests lined up to discuss business opportunities with Sterling Events. Judge Harrison's endorsement had triggered a cascade of interest from the city's most influential families, each eager to secure services from the company that had delivered such exceptional quality. Rather than allowing the focus to shift entirely away from Marcus and Catherine's celebration, I made a strategic decision that would demonstrate exactly the kind of character my parents had spent the evening questioning. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, reclaiming the microphone one final time. "While I'm deeply grateful for your enthusiasm about Sterling Events, I believe this evening should remain focused on celebrating Marcus and Catherine's marriage." The room settled back into attentive silence as guests recognized the appropriateness of my redirect. However, Sterling Events would like to offer the newlyweds and all our guests a special surprise to conclude this wonderful evening. We've prepared an elaborate dessert station premium coffee service and a late-night gourmet snack bar that will continue for the next 2 hours. Excited murmurs greeted this announcement as guests anticipated the additional treats. Late-night food stations were a Sterling Events signature that had become legendary among our regular clients. Our pastry chef has created custom desserts specifically for tonight's celebration, and our barista will provide handcrafted specialty beverages to complement the evening's final phase. I paused, allowing anticipation to build throughout the ballroom. "Sarah, would you please coordinate with the staff to begin the dessert presentation?" My operations manager approached the platform, her professional bearing commanding immediate respect from the assembled guests. Sarah had managed hundreds of high-profile events, and her expertise was visible in every detail of the evening's execution. But as she reached for the microphone, I activated our emergency communication protocol through my earpiece, quietly instructing key staff members to begin the strategic withdrawal process we developed for problematic client situations. Sterling Events had never needed to deploy this protocol at an actual event, but we'd rehearsed it extensively as preparation for worst-case scenarios involving abusive or dangerous clients. The irony that I was implementing it at my own brother's wedding wasn't lost on me. Due to unexpected family circumstances that have arisen this evening, I announced to the gathered guests, Sterling Events will need to conclude our service earlier than originally planned. However, we've arranged for Riverside Country Club's executive chef to provide continued refreshments at no additional charge to ensure your celebration continues seamlessly. The announcement generated surprised murmurs as guests processed this unexpected development. Most remained focused on the promise of continued hospitality rather than the implications of a catering company withdrawing from their own event. Judge Harrison approached me immediately, his expression showing both concern and admiration. Keegan, I hope the family circumstances aren't serious. Is there anything we can do to assist? His offer of help, delivered with genuine sincerity, highlighted exactly the kind of community support my parents had spent years undermining through their interference and character assassination. Thank you, Judge Harrison. The situation is complicated but not dangerous. I simply need to ensure that Sterling Events maintains the professional standards that have built our reputation in this community. Mrs. Pemberton joined our conversation, her business instincts recognizing the diplomatic language I was using to extract my company from a situation that could damage our professional standing. Your handling of this situation demonstrates exactly the kind of discretion and professionalism that makes Sterling Events so valuable, she said. I'll definitely be contacting you about our upcoming anniversary celebration. Word of my strategic withdrawal was spreading through the ballroom as influential guests began understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A successful businessman was removing his services from his own family's event due to treatment that violated his company's principles. Eleanor Blackwood approached my parents' table, her voice carrying clearly across the elegant space. Linda, I find myself confused about the discrepancy between Keegan's obvious success and the characterizations we heard earlier this evening. The mayor's wife's direct confrontation created a moment of absolute silence as 380 guests focused on my mother's response. Linda's face flushed as she struggled to reconcile their fictional narrative with the documented evidence of my achievements. Keegan has always been secretive about his activities. We had no idea about the extent of his business involvement. Judge Harrison's wife, Margaret, joined the conversation with the kind of moral authority that comes from decades of observing character in high-stakes situations. Secretive seems an inadequate explanation for the level of success Sterling Events has clearly achieved, she said coolly. Young people don't build companies of this caliber without substantial ability, dedication, and integrity. Her statement carried implicit criticism of any parents who would remain ignorant of such significant accomplishments in their child's life. Other society matrons were nodding agreement, their expressions showing growing disapproval of my parents' earlier behavior. Catherine's mother, Margaret Harrison, stepped forward to deliver what amounted to a public rebuke of my parents' conduct. I must say that witnessing a family member's professional success being treated with such dismissal reflects poorly on everyone involved, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone unaccustomed to being contradicted. Young man, she continued, addressing me directly, your company's service tonight has been absolutely exceptional, and your gracious handling of a difficult situation demonstrates exactly the character that builds lasting business relationships. Her endorsement created a ripple effect as other prominent families began distancing themselves from my parents while expressing support for my professional achievements and personal conduct. Marcus realized that his parents' behavior was threatening his new wife's family relationships and frantically attempted damage control. Mother, perhaps we should discuss this privately, he suggested, clearly hoping to contain the expanding social disaster. But Judge Harrison addressed him directly, his tone carrying the weight of judicial authority. Marcus, your brother has built something genuinely impressive while maintaining dignity under circumstances that would challenge anyone's character. I suggest you consider what that achievement says about his potential and your family's dynamics. The judge's words carried unmistakable criticism of the family treatment I'd endured while simultaneously establishing my credibility with the community's power structure. As my staff efficiently removed equipment and supplies under Sarah's coordinated direction, guests began approaching me individually to express both admiration for my business success and concern about the family dynamics they'd witnessed. Thomas Creek, the restaurant owner my father had sabotaged 3 years earlier, approached with obvious remorse. Keegan, I owe you a significant apology. I received information about your reliability that I now understand was completely false. I'd like to discuss reviving our partnership conversation, if you're interested. Similar confessions emerged from other business leaders as they connected my parents' earlier character assassination with opportunities that had mysteriously evaporated over the years. The community's business network was rapidly reassessing their understanding of my professional capabilities, while simultaneously recognizing the pattern of interference that had shaped their previous perceptions. Within 30 minutes, Sterling Events had completed our withdrawal while maintaining the appearance of professional service transition, rather than dramatic confrontation. The country club's staff had seamlessly assumed responsibility for continued hospitality, ensuring that Marcus and Catherine's celebration continued without interruption. But the social damage to my parents' reputation was irreversible. 380 influential people had witnessed the gap between their claims about family dynamics and the documented evidence of my professional success and personal character. More importantly, I'd demonstrated exactly the kind of principled leadership that builds lasting business relationships while maintaining dignity under pressure. As I prepared to leave Riverside Country Club, Judge Harrison approached for one final conversation. "Son, what you've accomplished tonight goes far beyond business success. You've shown this community what integrity looks like when tested by family pressure. That's a lesson worth remembering." His words carried the weight of someone who'd spent decades evaluating character in high-stakes situations. Coming from the community's most respected figure, his endorsement would establish my reputation far beyond anything my parents could undermine. The evening that had begun with my public humiliation had transformed into a demonstration of professional capability and personal character that would reshape my standing in the community permanently. 3 months later, I stood in the executive conference room of Sterling Events' new downtown headquarters reviewing contracts that represented more business than I'd generated in the previous 2 years combined. Judge Harrison's endorsement had opened doors throughout the city's elite social network, leading to partnerships with corporate clients, political organizations, and exactly the kind of high-profile families who defined our community's cultural landscape. The morning sunshine streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the historic district where I'd grown up feeling like an outsider to my own family's expectations. That perspective had changed completely following the wedding reception that transformed public humiliation into professional triumph. Sarah knocked on my office door carrying the preliminary planning documents for our latest booking. "The Harrison anniversary celebration is confirmed for next month. Judge Harrison specifically requested the same service team that worked Marcus's wedding." I smiled at the irony. The event that was supposed to demonstrate my inadequacy had instead become the foundation for Sterling Events' expansion into the city's most exclusive social circle. "Also," Sarah added with obvious amusement, "we received another inquiry from Mrs. Pemberton about catering her daughter's engagement party. That makes 4 bookings from families who attended the wedding." The networking effect had exceeded my most optimistic projections. Guests who'd witnessed my parents' character assassination, followed by my professional response, had spread word throughout their social networks about Sterling Events' exceptional quality and my personal integrity under pressure. Thomas Creek had renewed our partnership discussions within a week of the wedding, leading to a restaurant chain collaboration that would double our catering capacity by year-end. The deal my father had sabotaged 3 years earlier was proceeding even better than originally planned with additional locations and expanded service offerings. Most satisfying was the reversal in my parents' social standing. Their cruel behavior had become legendary within the country club community, but for all the wrong reasons. Families who'd previously respected their business success now questioned their character and judgment. David had lost 2 significant commercial real estate opportunities when potential partners learned about his interference in my professional relationships. Word had spread through the business community about his warnings to Thomas Creek and other entrepreneurs, creating suspicion about his reliability and ethics. Linda faced complete ostracism from the society circles where she'd built her identity. The same women who'd laughed at her stories about my failures now refused her invitations and excluded her from charitable organizations where reputation mattered more than wealth. The country club membership committee had quietly suggested they consider alternative social venues a polite way of indicating their behavior had violated community standards for family conduct. Marcus discovered that his parents' actions had damaged his new marriage more than he'd anticipated. Catherine had been horrified to learn the full extent of their sabotage and manipulation, leading to serious discussions about family boundaries and future relationships. Judge Harrison had withdrawn several business referrals he'd been providing to Marcus's law firm, explaining that he couldn't recommend attorneys whose families demonstrated such poor judgment and character. Other legal connections had similarly evaporated as the story spread through professional networks. But the most significant development came 6 weeks after the wedding, when Linda suffered a minor heart episode that required emergency hospitalization. The health scare forced a reckoning with family relationships that had been poisoned by years of competition and manipulation. I visited her in the cardiac unit, bringing flowers from my own garden, rather than an expensive arrangement that might suggest financial superiority. She looked smaller and more vulnerable in the hospital bed, stripped of the social armor she'd used to project strength and control. "I never understood why you kept your success secret," she said, her voice weaker than I'd ever heard. "Because every time I achieved something, you found ways to undermine it," I replied honestly. "I needed space to build something without interference or sabotage." David sat in the corner chair, looking older than his 62 years. The confident businessman who'd publicly dismantled my reputation had been replaced by someone who understood that actions have consequences beyond immediate family dynamics. "We thought we were protecting you from disappointment," he said, though his words lacked conviction. "You were protecting yourselves from admitting that your judgment about my potential was wrong," I corrected. "Instead of celebrating my achievements, you worked to prevent them, because success would contradict the narrative you'd created." Linda's tears came slowly, the kind of crying that suggests genuine recognition rather than manipulative self-pity. "I was terrified of losing both my sons," she admitted. "I thought keeping you dependent would keep you close while pushing Marcus toward independence would make him successful." "But you achieved the opposite," I said gently. "Marcus learned that family relationships could be manipulated for personal advantage, while I learned that I couldn't trust the people who were supposed to support my growth." The conversation continued for 2 hours as we unpacked years of family dysfunction that had masqueraded as normal parenting. David admitted his jealousy of my natural entrepreneurial abilities and his fear that my success would diminish his own achievements. Linda confessed to deliberately sabotaging relationships because she wanted to remain the most important woman in both sons' lives. The extent of their interference was even broader than I'd discovered, including romantic relationships, friendships, and professional opportunities spanning nearly a decade. But instead of allowing their revelations to fuel more resentment, I made a choice that surprised even myself. "I'm willing to rebuild our relationship, but only with complete honesty and respect for boundaries," I told them. "No more interference, no more sabotage, and no more public humiliation disguised as family guidance." David looked genuinely shocked. "After everything we've done, you'd give us another chance." "Because family should mean supporting each other's growth, not sabotaging it out of fear or jealousy," I explained. "I learned that lesson from watching how Sterling Events succeeds by lifting people up rather than tearing them down." We established clear conditions for moving forward. They would attend family therapy to address the dysfunction that had poisoned our relationships. They would make genuine apologies to people they'd hurt, including Thomas Creek and other business contacts they'd sabotaged. Most importantly, they would respect my independence and success without trying to control or undermine either. The process wasn't instant or easy. Months of therapy sessions revealed generational patterns of competition and emotional manipulation that had shaped our family dynamics for decades. But gradually, genuine healing began replacing the toxic cycles that had defined our relationships. Marcus struggled more with the changes than our parents. His identity had been built on being the favored son, and recognizing the artificial nature of that preference challenged his fundamental understanding of himself and his achievements. Catherine played a crucial role in his growth, refusing to accept the family dynamics she'd witnessed and insisting on healthier patterns for their future children. Her influence helped Marcus recognize that genuine success comes from authentic achievement rather than comparative advantage over siblings. 1 year later, I catered Marcus and Catherine's first anniversary celebration. This time, however, I attended openly as both family member and business owner with my parents, proudly introducing me to guests as their successful entrepreneur son. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it represented genuine progress toward healthier family relationships based on mutual respect rather than competition and control. Judge Harrison delivered a toast that evening that captured the lesson I'd learned through the painful process of family healing. True success isn't measured by defeating others or protecting ourselves from perceived threats, he said, raising his glass toward our family table. It's measured by our ability to lift each other up, especially when tested by difficult circumstances. Standing in that same ballroom where I'd once been publicly humiliated, surrounded by family members who now treated me with genuine respect and pride, I understood that the greatest victory wasn't business success or social rehabilitation. The greatest victory was choosing forgiveness and growth over resentment and revenge, creating space for authentic relationships to develop where manipulation and competition had once flourished. Sterling Events continued expanding beyond my wildest projections, but the company's success felt meaningful, primarily because it provided a platform for treating people with the dignity and respect that builds lasting relationships. Every client interaction became an opportunity to demonstrate the values I'd learned through overcoming family dysfunction, that everyone deserves support for their dreams, that success should lift others rather than diminish them, and that authentic relationships require honesty even when truth feels uncomfortable. The wedding that was supposed to demonstrate my inadequacy instead taught me that real strength comes from maintaining integrity under pressure, choosing growth over resentment, and building success on principles that honor everyone involved, rather than just protecting ourselves. If you've ever faced family members who undermined your dreams or questioned your potential, remember that their limitations don't define your possibilities. Sometimes the people closest to us reveal our true strength by testing it under the most challenging circumstances. What would you do if you discovered that family members had been secretly sabotaging your success for years? How do you think you'd handle the choice between revenge and forgiveness when given the power to prove them wrong? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this journey of family healing and personal growth. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming adversity, and share it with anyone who might benefit from understanding that success is possible even when the people closest to us doubt our potential. Remember that your dreams are valid, your efforts matter, and authentic success comes from staying true to your values even when tested by those who should support you most.